On a sweltering Baltimore afternoon, the kind where the asphalt seemed to breathe heat, a roadside pit smoldered with smoke. The scent was intoxicating. Spiced meat hissing on the grate, grease dripping into fire, flames spitting back in anger. Truckers pulled over. Office workers stopped on their way home. Strangers lined up with dollar bills in hand. They ate, they chewed, they swallowed. Nobody asked what kind of meat it was. Weeks later, whispers began. A woman vanished. Then another. Names without faces. Lives without obituaries. By the time police caught the man behind the pit, he wasn't ashamed. He wasn't afraid. He laughed. He leaned forward and said, almost proudly, "You've eaten them. You all ate them. And you never knew." There are urban legends that belong to campfires and horror movies. And then there are men like Joseph Roy Metheny, who blur the line until folklore tastes like dinner. Imagine a barbecue stand by the roadside, the kind with cheap paper plates, grease bleeding through the flimsy cardboard, smoke curling upward like a dark prayer. A man stand behind the counter, sweaty, grinning, flipping patties with the ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times. The customers line up, casual, hungry, none the wiser. They bite into thick, juicy sandwiches, the flavor oddly rich, unforgettable in ways they can't put into words. Now imagine the truth, that some of those sandwiches may not have been pork at all. The whispers about Joe Metheny have the sickening weight of urban legend. The man who sold human meat sandwiches. It sounds like the kind of grotesque folktale you'd swap around a campfire. Too ridiculous, too monstrous to be real. And yet, buried inside police records and courtroom confessions, there it is. He said it himself, with no shame, no tremor of regret. He claimed he mixed human flesh with animal meat and sold it from a small open pit he manned by the roadside in Baltimore. Picture the horror. Commuters and truckers unknowingly chewing the remains of missing women, their lives reduced to ground meat and seasoning. Metheny laughed about it. Laughed while explaining how easily people consumed his product, how no one ever suspected. They ate it, he once said, and they never knew. And here's the part that lingers, gnaws at the edges of sanity. Was he telling the truth, or was this one last performance? A carnival of lies from a man who delighted in filth and shock? With Joe Metheny, reality is a warped funhouse mirror, and every reflection is worse than the one before. This is not the story of a single killing, not just a chronicle of blood spilled on the margins of society. This is the story of hunger, feral, unrestrained, and metaphorical hunger. A man starving for control, for domination, for revenge against a world he thought had mocked him. And if you follow the trail of his life, it reads less like biography and more like a grotesque ballad written by some deranged poet with grease-stained hands. The roadside stand is gone now. The sandwiches consumed long ago. But the question remains, rotting quietly in the background. How many people unknowingly swallowed the truth of Joe Metheny's darkness? Baltimore in the 1990s wasn't a glitzy, waterfront postcard version tourists snapped in the inner harbor. Beneath the seafood restaurants and family attractions was a city carved up by poverty, rust, and the ever-present hum of violence. The docks were rotting, industry was fading, and addiction was everywhere, like a shadow that clung to neighborhoods and refused to let go. It was an era when abandoned row houses lined the streets like crooked teeth, whole blocks reduced to hollow shells. The streets weren't empty, though. They teemed with people searching for something: escape, drugs, fast cash, or just a night's reprieve from despair. The underworld was not some distant concept. It lived here, shoulder to shoulder with the ordinary. Baltimore's industrial belly was full of men who worked the shifts no one envied, grinding hours at steel mills, sawdust-suffused lumberyards, and trucking routes that never ended. They worked until their backs broke, then drowned the pain in bars tucked under flickering neon signs. Those bars served as havens for forgotten. Truck drivers, drifters, sex workers, addicts. Everyone knew everyone's business, and nobody cared until something went wrong. In this atmosphere, the police were overworked, understaffed, and often numb to the daily grind of crimes that seemed almost routine. Missing women, especially those working the streets, rarely made headlines. A vanished daughter might be reported, sure, but the system was sluggish, stretched, and indifferent. The cries of the marginalized blended into the noise of the city, unheard, unanswered. This was the soil where Joe Metheny thrived. Baltimore's neglected corners offered him anonymity. Its broken institutions gave him opportunity, and its overlooked victims, women who vanished with hardly a ripple, handed him silence. A city crumbling at its edges provided the perfect camouflage for a man like him. And what a man he was. Not some shadowy figure slinking in alleyways, but a towering brute who could dominate a room just by standing in it. 6'1", pushing nearly 500 pounds at his peak, Metheny was the kind of presence you couldn't ignore. But in a city already saturated with chaos, even a giant can go unnoticed if he knows where to stand. The 90s in Baltimore were about survival. Everyone was hustling, the addicts chasing highs, the police chasing ghosts, the working poor chasing paychecks. But behind the alleys, under the bridges, in the quiet dead zones where the light didn't reach, that's where Metheny set up his stage. That's where the nightmare fermented, just waiting to be served. Joseph Roy Metheny. Even his name feels heavy, like it should be stamped on the side of an iron freight car instead of whispered in the same breath as horror stories. He wasn't the slick, charming predator that true crime stories often romanticize. No, Metheny was the brute force archetype, massive, sweaty, with a face that could look both pitiful and terrifying depending on the light. If Hannibal Lecter was a refined nightmare, Joe Metheny was a swamp thing that crawled out of America's industrial backlots. He was born in 1955 in Baltimore, and almost in the beginning, his life read like the script of a tragedy nobody wanted to watch. His father was killed in a car accident when Joe was 6. His mother, left alone with 6 children, scrambled to keep the family afloat. Metheny later claimed he was abandoned, left to grow up in foster homes, starved of affection and guidance. His mother denied it, insisting she worked 2 jobs and did the best she could. Either way, the damage was done. His childhood was not warm. It was cold, brittle, and mean. As a teenager, he discovered escape through substances and rebellion. He joined the army, but rumors suggest he spent more time chasing powder and bottles than building discipline. By the time he returned to civilian life, he was already a drifting storm of unmet needs and unresolved rage. He picked up work in construction and as a forklift driver, but stability was an alien concept to him. And yet, when people described him casually, many said he could be friendly, charming. Even, he wasn't always the monster lurking in the shadows. He'd share a beer, crack a joke, buy a round for strangers. But underneath the friendliness was a roiling ocean of anger, a grudge against the world, against women, against anyone who left him feeling powerless. His physical size was both a shield and a weapon. At over 450 pounds, he loomed, and he knew it. He used that body as intimidation, as leverage, as proof that he could not be ignored. In interviews and confessions, he wielded his own bulk as part of the mythology of Joe Metheny, the gentle giant who turned grotesque. The seeds of cruelty had already sprouted in him long before his name was tied to anything infamous. Friends, or what passed for them, described a man who flipped between generosity and violence with whiplash speed. One minute he'd be buying dinner, the next he'd be swinging fists. It wasn't just mood swings. It was an unstable gravity that pulled people toward him and then crushed them without warning. Metheny fashioned himself into something more than a man. He wanted to be feared, to be known, to carve his name into the city's rotten foundations. He was not content to vanish into poverty and obscurity like the others who populated Baltimore's forgotten underworld. He wanted to be remembered, even if remembrance came soaked in terror. It begins, as so many grim stories do, with someone vanishing and no one paying attention. Women went missing in Baltimore's underbelly all the time. Sex workers, addicts, drifters. They slipped through the cracks like cigarette ash scattered on a windy night. Their disappearances barely made the news, barely stirred the police into action. And that silence, that societal shrug, was the perfect cloak for Joe Metheny. The disturbance that jolted his life into infamy started in 1994. Metheny claimed his partner at the time, the woman he lived with, the mother of his child, abandoned him, packed up, ran off with another man, and took the child with her. According to Metheny, it was betrayal written in fire. His story, the way he told it later, sounded less like heartbreak and more like a manifesto. She took my kid. She took my life. Somebody was going to pay. This rage simmered, then boiled. Metheny stalked the places where forgotten gathered, the corners under bridges, the shacks littered with bottles, the shadow-marked encampments where drugs whispered louder than morality. He hunted for his girlfriend, for the man she allegedly left with. He didn't find them, but he found others. The pattern began there, in a storm of alcohol, drugs, and rage. One night, he lured two men he thought had information about his girlfriend. Metheny later confessed he killed them both in a fit of fury, not with precision, not with calculation, but with raw, bludgeoning brutality. He claimed their bodies were dumped near the Patapsco River, as though discarding trash. And that was just the start. But here's the unnerving part. The details shift depending on who's telling the story, Metheny himself or the courts. He was a liar as much as he was a killer, a man who relished the theater of shock. Did those first murders even happen as he described? Police found bones in those days. Yes, they found remnants along the riverbank. But the evidence was never neat, never solid. The truth blurred with his boasting, and that blur itself was his weapon. From there, the disturbance rippled outward. Women began to vanish. Metheny admitted to targeting sex workers, inviting them with promises of drugs or shelter, only to unleash the violence coiled inside him. Their names faded into the anonymity of the streets, rarely spoken in newspapers, rarely mourned outside small circles. For Metheny, they were both revenge and raw material. The first disturbance wasn't just about a woman leaving him or a child being taken away. It was about a man deciding that the world owed him blood. That betrayal had to be answered with cruelty. That pain demanded multiplication. From the moment he declared war on those who crossed him, Baltimore had a new monster, though almost no one realized it yet. The thing about Joe Metheny is that his crimes didn't announce themselves with the drama of police sirens or the flashbulbs of press cameras. They unfolded like background noise in a city already drowning in chaos. Women went missing, yes, but women always went missing in Baltimore's red light districts. To the system, it was a tired story, already told too many times. And this is where the mystery coils itself into something truly grotesque. Metheny wasn't hiding in shadows. He was in plain view, working his forklift job, hanging out at dive bars, telling stories with beer in hand. To his co-workers, he was just Joe, a big guy with a dark sense of humor, maybe a little off, but nothing worth calling the police over. Meanwhile, behind a veneer of normality, he claimed to be perfecting a ritual. According to his later confessions, Metheny had a method. He lured women under bridges, into his trailer, or down to the banks of the Patapsco. He'd offer them drugs, maybe a safe place a night. Then he'd unleash the violence he claimed was fueled by betrayal and rage. And then, the part that made the headlines, the part that turned whispers into legend, he said he butchered their bodies and ground the flesh into patties. mix it with pork, serve it up to hungry strangers from a small open pit stand. That's the detail that makes you stop breathing for a second. Because if it's true, then dozens, maybe hundreds, of ordinary people consumed his violence without ever knowing it. They became unwilling participants in his theater of cruelty. But here's the catch. The police never found hard evidence of the meat stand. No health permits, no steady location, no physical remains to match his confession. Was it all real? Or was Metheny embellishing, spinning himself into a larger-than-life monster? That's the twisted brilliance of his story. It forces you to wrestle with the uncertainty. Meanwhile, the victims remain shadows. The justice system barely recorded their names. Most were sex workers, women battling addiction, women without strong networks to advocate for them. The public didn't clamor for answers, and the police didn't break their backs connecting the dots. The mystery deepens not because we don't know what Metheny did, but because we can't ever be sure how much of his tale is theater. Was he a killer who fed flesh to unsuspecting strangers? Or was he a killer who found joy in inventing new ways to horrify the world? Either way, the result is the same. He took lives, and the truth about how far his cruelty spread remains rotting in silence, like bodies buried in shallow graves along the river. The police didn't descend on Joe Metheny's world like a cinematic cavalry. His unraveling was slower, dirtier, and marked by bureaucratic fumbling. In 1996, after a woman barely escaped one of his attacks, the case finally began to tilt in the direction of justice. She staggered into the night half-naked, battered, and gasping for air. That survivor's testimony became the thread investigators could no longer ignore. Once they had his name, detectives began to dig. What they unearthed was a patchwork of half-truths and eerie coincidences. A forklift operator who lived in a trailer by a pallet company, a man who frequented the rougher corners of Baltimore, a giant of a figure known for his temper. And then the confession started. Not whispered admissions, but brazen declarations. Metheny telling investigators more than they ever expected to hear. He admitted to killing. He admitted to dismembering. He admitted to feeding flesh to strangers. And yet his confessions were so overstuffed with detail, so lurid and grandiose, that investigators had to pause. Was he bragging to inflate his own legend? Or was this the sickening truth that had gone unnoticed for years? Theories began to spiral. Some detectives believed he was embellishing, padding his body count like a fisherman describing a catch. Others, chilled by the consistency in certain details, argued he was telling them exactly what had happened. One theory suggests Metheny's roadside stand was real but temporary, a makeshift pit stop for truckers, a cash grab set up and taken down in days. Another theory says the sandwich stand was pure invention, a grotesque fantasy designed to cement his reputation as something more than just another Baltimore killer. Forensics, maddeningly, provided little clarity. Bodies were too decomposed, evidence too scattered. In some cases, there was nothing left at all. Metheny's own storytelling filled the gaps, and he seemed to relish the performance, smirking, laughing, giving interviews where he rolled his words like a chef savoring a recipe. He even mocked his victims, sneering at how easy it was to lure them. The investigators were left with contradictions. A compulsive liar who might also be one of the few people willing to tell them the horrifying truth. And here's where the psychological horror sets in. Because whether his sandwich confession was fact or fiction, he had already won. He had planted the seed in the public's mind. Every hamburger bought from a roadside grill in Baltimore carried a ghostly aftertaste of suspicion. Every bite of pork was shadowed by the thought, what if? And that's the kind of terror you can't arrest, can't prosecute, can't close with a neat courtroom verdict. That's the terror Joe Metheny created. An investigation that chased facts but kept colliding with myth. There's a moment in every grotesque saga where the mask slips, where the monster no longer hides in the margins but stares society in the face. For Joe Metheny, That moment came when he sat in an interrogation room, sweating, massive, and strangely amused by the chaos he had orchestrated. Instead of clamming up, instead of lawyering his way into silence, he spilled. And not reluctantly, gleefully, he painted himself as a man wronged, a victim of betrayal who had transformed grief into vengeance. He claimed he killed 10 people, maybe more. He described dismemberment with the cold ease of someone talking about chopping firewood. And then came the bombshell. His so-called meat stand, the roadside setup where he supposedly mixed flesh into pork and sold it to unsuspecting strangers. Detectives didn't even ask about it. He volunteered the detail like a salesman showing off his prize feature. But here's where the breakdown lies. Not just Metheny's psyche, but in the entire system around him. The courts didn't know what to do with his avalanche of claims. Which confessions were true? Which were lies? He recanted some, doubled down on others, and in the process, turned his trial into a circus of horror. Prosecutors tried to stitch together coherent narratives from a man who delighted in ripping them apart. For a brief, surreal moment, Metheny seemed almost proud, like a grotesque celebrity basking in the spotlight. He taunted the police, bragged to reporters, even wrote his own confessions as though crafting a memoir. It was less trial, more performance art, except the props were human lives. The turning point was supposed to be clarity, a survivor's testimony, a captured suspect, a courtroom laying the truth bare. Instead, what unfolded was ambiguity weaponized. Metheny wasn't just on trial for murder. He was on trial for reality itself. Was the meat stand real? Were there more victims? Had he truly killed 10? Or was he building himself into an American boogeyman to be remembered long after the cell door clanged shut? What's worse is how quickly the world consumed it. The media sees the human meat sandwich angle like sharks in bloodied water. Headlines blared. Radio hosts joked. The public gasped and gagged, then went back to their fast food, wondering if the taste in their mouths had changed. The breakdown was total. A killer who wanted to be infamous, a justice system drowning in contradictions, and a city too weary to look its own darkness in the eye. Baltimore wanted closure. What it got instead was Joe Metheny's twisted encore. Resolution, in the case of Joe Metheny, feels like the wrong word. A resolution implies neatness, a tied ribbon at the end of the package. What we got instead was a courtroom wringing its hands over a man who was equal parts clown and executioner. He was convicted, yes, life sentences stacked on top of one another, the kind of mathematical punishment designed to say, we're locking the door and throwing away the key. Later, one of those sentences was reduced, and for a time he stared down the possibility of walking free. That thought alone should send a shiver down your spine. Yet the lingering questions are louder than the gavels ever were. Did he really serve human flesh to strangers? The police never found a shred of physical evidence proving it. No grills, no scraps of meat linked to missing women, no forensic smoking gun. The only source was Metheny's own mouth, and that mouth was a furnace of lies, half-truths, and deliberate provocations. Then there's the body count. Officially, he was convicted of a handful of murders. Unofficially, he boasted of many more. 10, maybe a dozen. Sometimes more, depending on which version of his confession you read. But law enforcement could only prove a fraction of it. The rest drifted into limbo, leaving families without closure and leaving us with the sickening suspicion that some victims remain forever hidden in Baltimore soil. Even Metheny's motives remain fogged. Was it revenge for a girlfriend who left him? Or was that just the excuse he fed himself, a narrative to justify the violence he already craved? Some investigators believe the whole revenge story was a cover, a way to give meaning to something that was, in truth, meaningless, a bottomless appetite for cruelty dressed up as tragedy. And finally, the most grotesque question of all, If the sandwich stand was real, how many people unknowingly took part in his violence? How many commuters, truckers, everyday families stopped by his pit and ate something that should never been eaten? That question is a poison with no antidote, because whether or not it's true, the possibility lingers every time the story is told. So, the resolution is this: Joe Metheny went to prison and he never came back out. But the lingering questions about the sandwiches, the body count, the truth versus the myth will never be resolved. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all. Joe Metheny died in prison in 2017, slumped in his cell like a grotesque statue finally toppled by time. There was no grand ending, no courtroom confession that solved every riddle. Just a body in a cell, discovered by guards who probably muttered something under their breath, and went about the grim paperwork of another inmate gone cold. For a man who fed on spectacle, his death was almost insultingly quiet, but his legacy, that's louder than ever. He has become a permanent fixture in America's catalog of nightmare figures: the so-called cannibal killer, the hamburger man, the urban legend whispered in gas stations and barrooms. Every Halloween, every true crime forum, every late-night podcast that wants to shock an audience brings up his name. And every time, the same question resurfaces. Did he actually serve human meat, or was it all a smirk and a lie? The aftermath for Baltimore was more subtle, but no less haunting. Families of missing women never got their answers. For them, Metheny's claims were salt rubbed into wounds already decades old. Some clung to the hope that he was exaggerating, that their loved ones weren't part of his menu. Others were left in the torment of maybe, a word more cruel than yes or no. Culturally, Metheny has warped into something almost folkloric, a twisted roadside cryptid. His story circulates not just as true crime, but as a grotesque cautionary tale, a reminder of how society abandons certain groups: sex workers, addicts, the homeless, and that abandonment creates a hunting ground for predators. He thrived because the world looked away. That's his real legacy. Proof that indifference can be just as deadly as the man swinging the weapon. There's irony too, bitter and sharp. Metheny wanted fame, and he got it. Not the fame of movie stars or athletes, but the darker immortality of a man whose name is forever linked to horror. He is remembered not for who he was, but for the foul image he projected: a roadside stand, smoke curling up, customers chewing slowly, never knowing what they were really tasting. Every culture has its boogeymen, its stories meant to keep children awake at night. Joe Metheny forced himself into that role, grinning all the way. His body may collapse in a prison cell, but his legend still gnaws at us, because it blurs the line between fact and folklore, and it leaves us with an aftertaste that refuses to fade. Joe Metheny's story is not about sandwiches. Not really. It's about hunger, an endless, gnawing hunger that no meal could satisfy. Hunger for revenge, for domination, for recognition. Hunger to twist the ordinary, food, family, survival, into something obscene. He was less a man than a grotesque metaphor, wearing a stained t-shirt, lumbering through Baltimore's forgotten corners, turning his bitterness into legend. Think about it. The police never proved the meat stand. They couldn't. Maybe it existed, maybe it didn't. But does it matter? The idea alone was enough to poison imaginations. Every roadside barbecue, every greasy burger joint suddenly carried a phantom flavor. That's Metheny's true horror, not the act itself, but the story. He weaponized narrative, made himself unforgettable, ensured that people would gag on his name long after his body rotted in a cell. And what does that say about us? About a society that lets certain lives vanish without notice? About how quickly we consume horror when it's neatly packaged for us. Metheny thrived in the blind spots, on the margins where lives were disposable, and then he turned those blind spots into his own mythology. He forced us to look, not just at him, but at the ugly truth of who we ignore. If there's one thought to leave hanging in the air, it's this. Monsters like Joe Metheny aren't born in isolation. They are cultivated by neglect, by poverty, by the indifference that lets a scream fade into background noise. He may have been one man, grotesque and unforgettable, but he was also a reflection of a system that failed at every level. And here's the cruel irony, the last laugh that echoes long after his death. Somewhere, sometime, someone bit into a greasy sandwich from a roadside pit and thought, God, that's delicious. Maybe it was pork. Maybe it wasn't. The truth is buried with him. But the doubt, that doubt will never die. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.